You will hear part of a lecture on art history. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 10. In the exam, you would have 40 seconds to look at the questions. Pause the recording for 40 seconds now. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10.
In the last lectures, we looked at the art of the ancient Egyptians, and then considered the art of other ancient Mediterranean civilizations, in particular Greece and Rome. We're now going to return to Egypt to consider a set of very unusual pictures known as the Fayum portraits. The Fayum is a lush green area about 100 kilometers west of Cairo. Following the conquest of Egypt by the Greek warrior Alexander the Great in 332 BC, large numbers of businessmen and officials who had come over from Greece settled in this fertile region with their families. They gradually adopted some features of Egyptian culture, including the practice of mummification, embalming the bodies of their dead and wrapping them in linen bandages in order to preserve them as mummies. The name actually comes from an Arabic word meaning an embalmed body. These newcomers made one distinctive innovation, though. After binding the mummy, they laid over the face a picture representing the person inside. The portraits look like oil on canvas, but they were actually produced using a technique called encaustic, where the artist applies pigmented wax to a wooden board with a small spatula. The Egyptologist William Petrie, who discovered many of these mummies with their accompanying portraits at the end of the 19th century, was convinced that they were actually done in the lifetime of the subject, rather than being painted after the person's death, as had been the case with older Egyptian paintings. He felt they were very different from the traditional stylized images that had been used on Egyptian mummy casings in previous centuries, and was convinced that they were actually portraits giving a realistic depiction of the person. He pointed out that the boards on which they were painted showed signs of having been cut down to size to fit within the mummy bandages. To him, this suggested that they may have originally been larger and been hung in the houses of the owners during their lifetimes. But more than a century after they came to light, nobody knew how far they were really depictions of real people, as against idealized portraits. Then a team from Manchester University decided to find out, by recreating the faces of Fayum mummies in clay and then comparing the reconstructions with the portraits. The team was provided with skulls from 2 Fayum mummies from the British Museum and given the information, based on X-rays and other evidence, that one of the mummies was of a 50-year-old man and the other was a woman in her early 20s. Armed only with this information, they set to work. First, they created copies of the skulls. Then they used clay to build up the facial muscles in order to reconstruct what the person looked like. After weeks of painstaking labour, 2 faces emerged. Only then were the 2 portraits revealed so that the match between the reconstructions and the portraits could be examined. In the case of the man, both model and portrait showed a broad, flat face with a slightly hooked nose and a fleshy mouth with broad lips. But the man in the portrait was noticeable for his 5 o'clock shadow, the beard beginning to grow around his chin and on his cheeks. This would have been quite a recognizable feature of the man in real life, and an easy thing for the painter to copy. However, it wasn't something that the makers of the model could know about. In the reconstruction, the right eye was slightly higher than the left, and this was the same on the portrait. But on the portrait, the eyes were very large, which is standard with many of the Fayum portraits, while in the model they were longer and narrower. The portrait of the woman appeared to be even more of a standard type, with her large eyes, straight nose, and small mouth. These pretty feminine features suggested this could be an idealized woman's face, and yet it proved to match the reconstruction surprisingly closely. The proportions of the lower face corresponded, and so did those of the forehead, though in the portrait the eyes were closer together and larger than in the reconstruction. And in both cases, the head was set on a solid neck, suggesting a more powerful physique than you might have expected from these delicate features. So, overall, the similarities between the portraits and the models are too close to be accidental. The artists may have started from a standard picture, but attempts were made to modify this to reflect the characteristics of the subject, what gave the face its personal qualities. Obviously, this isn't much of a sample upon which to judge an entire genre of portraiture, but the researchers are convinced that, on the whole, the artists aimed to represent their subjects as they appeared in real life, whether this was flattering to them or not.
That is the end of section 1. Test 1. Listening. Section 2. You will hear a talk about young people living on their own. Listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 12.
Loneliness is something we all suffer from in varying degrees, but young people living on their own can be particularly vulnerable. Many who leave the family home find they are less confident and have more difficulty in finding their feet than they expected. Often, going to work or study in another town or city will be the first time they have lived away from home. Although this may sound like an adventure for those dying to get away from the glare of the parental eye, for others it is a daunting prospect which generates apprehension, uncertainty, and even fear. In fact, in a recent survey of over 1,600 people who had recently left home, 32% said that understanding and coping with loneliness was a crucial issue for them and made them feel highly stressed and distracted. An annual report by researchers last year recorded a noticeable increase in the number of individuals with homesickness, transition and isolation issues. Acknowledging that feelings of loneliness and isolation could impede progress at work or study, they examined the number of people using the welfare and health services. They found that young people in particular were prone to difficulties. Last year, 61% of all people using counselling services were aged under 30, and of this group, 57% were men.
Test 2. Listening. Section 2. Now listen and answer questions 13 to 20.
Leaving home involves a major change in lifestyle, work patterns, and degree of independence. You will be away from home, family, and friends, and are no longer supported by familiar surroundings. For this reason, in the first year, a lot of young people suffer from loneliness. Ironically, this sense of isolation comes at a time when you are likely to be surrounded by people most of the time. Living in a busy city, travelling on crowded buses and trains, you will be constantly among people. But this can sometimes compound your sense of being alone. Seeing others who appear at ease among large crowds, mingling and making friends, can make you feel excluded and inadequate. Adapting to a new environment makes people uncertain of what to do or how to behave and breeds insecurities which can make for a real sense of isolation. It is often those who are more used to being on their own who deal best with the transitional period of leaving home. Other reasons for feeling alone include high expectations of the big city, where you have the best time of your life and meet lifelong friends. It may be the first time you have had to make new friends since you started primary school, and perhaps you are reluctant or finding it hard to replace old friends whom you miss. There are also pressures to juggle work and socialising, which may leave you feeling left out. Or it could be that you have a long-distance relationship and feel torn between your new lifestyle and that special person who lives so far away. Because loneliness can leave you with a sense of low self-esteem, where you become self-conscious and feel you have been rejected, it is very difficult to overcome. You may be reluctant to even try and make new friends or take part in social activities, and will also find it difficult to say no to things, leaving you feeling exploited and weak. One of the ways of combating loneliness is to remember that it's not your fault, and that it's something everyone has to deal with, despite appearances. Counsellors advise those feeling lonely to speak to someone they know about their feelings. They also ask them to consider joining groups and societies and to get involved in activities which interest them as a way of meeting more people. Of course, overdoing it and jamming your schedule with too many things just to avoid being alone will not work. But meeting others with common interests may be a step forward. If you still feel like you need someone to talk to, you could try group counselling, where you will be able to talk to and receive support from a small number of people with the same difficulties as you. For more information or to be put in touch with an individual counsellor, contact the local town hall support services.
You will hear a conversation between two students working on a presentation. You have 30 seconds to look at questions 21 to 24.
Hey Chris, thanks for coming. Are you ready to practice our presentation for tomorrow?
Yeah, just give me a moment to switch on my laptop. There we go. Okay, what do you think?
Wow, that actually looks really nice. Well done. So
I've put the title up here in the middle, Reasons People Move Out of Their Parents' Homes. I thought we could start with the general graph outlining why people fly the nest at any age, and then we could break it down to age groups and social or ethnic backgrounds before we get into how our findings fit into what sociologists say about leaving your parents' house and what the effects of the timing and the circumstances of your decision can be.
that sounds good to me. So we can start with the bar chart here. Do you think they'll be able to read the tiny letters here?
No, which is why we'll have to read them out to them.
Okay, so we could take turns then. I'd start with bar A, which says that the number one reason that young people leave home is to go to college or university.
Exactly. And then I'd go on to the second bar, which gives the number of people who said they felt smothered by their parents' control over their lives and decided to get their own house to avoid that.
Right. Then in bar C, we've got people who found a job and decided that it was a good opportunity to move away because of their new income.
Yep, and then those who didn't feel exactly smothered by their parents per se, but more so because of the lack of room in their parents' house and the fact that their parents were around pretty much 90% of the time.
Maybe we should move this bar so that it can be next to bar B, since they seem to be quite similar to each other.
Well, actually, that's why I kept them separate. But maybe you're right. They would lead smoothly into one another. So that means that jobs will now be bar D and bar E.
Bar E is about those who moved because of their partner or spouse.
Right. And then at the end, we've got those who were pushed to leave by their parents and those who left because of a conflict at home.
I guess at this point we should mention that, as expected, we had almost 0 people reply that they left home because of emancipation or abuse, despite the fact that our study was conducted anonymously, probably because the participants didn't feel confident enough to share such private details with us. Or maybe just because there was no one in our pool of participants with such experiences.
Yeah.
You now have 30 seconds to look at questions 25 to 29.
So then we can break it down to age groups and show these 4 different graphs for our 4 age groups. Under 18s, 18 to 20, 21 to 24, and 25 and above.
Shall we take the graphs by age, or should we start with the second group? What do you think? Because we haven't got that much data on under 18s, and starting with 25 and above would also feel a bit strange to me, seeing as it was our second smallest group, and most participants were between 18 and 24 when they moved out of their parents' home.
Yeah, you're right. Perhaps we should start with our 2 biggest groups and then move on to the other 2.
So, you can present 18 to 20, and I can present 21 to 24. And then we can maybe present the other 2 groups together.
I think it's best if we present them separately, since the findings are so different.
Yeah, I guess you're right. So, I can present the under 18s, and you can present the 25 and over.
Perfect. Or, wait, should we do it the other way round, so it flows more naturally?
Yeah, sure. And then we can include a brief note at the end for those who haven't moved out yet.
Yeah, great.
You now have 30 seconds to look at question 30.
Excellent. So, then we can move on to the final chart before we get to the bibliography and explain what they said they found difficult when they moved out.
Yeah, so we can say the biggest issue for everyone was finding a place to live, especially for those who didn't have a guarantor or didn't live in a student hall of residence.
Yes, and that 30% of the participants also experienced some financial problems in the beginning, with bills and rent and food and everything.
Right. Then an even larger number reported that they didn't expect to miss their family that much, but ended up visiting their parents' home often just to see them and spend some time with them.
Although, we should probably cut that number down a notch to exclude those who went back home just so their parents could cook and do their laundry for them.
Yeah, sure. Anyway, then we should finish off with the final issue, which was flatmates.
Oh yeah, so we should say that a whopping 67% complained about the people they had to live with, and that they were often dirty and inconsiderate.
Right. Great. So then we can move on to how our findings fit into...
Now turn to Section 4. Section 4. You will hear part of a lecture about urban migration. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40.
Now, listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Good afternoon, and welcome to my talk on urban migration today. The world has experienced unprecedented urban growth in the recent decades. As much as 3% of Earth's landmass has been urbanized, an increase of at least 50% over previous estimates. Today, people living in cities already outnumber those in rural areas, and the trend does not appear to be reversing. In addition, cities have larger amounts of carbon consumption than rural areas. This is a result from two major aspects. First, with the increase of urban population around the world, the massive construction of urban infrastructure and residential housing is hard to avoid. Second, urban households have a higher rate of car ownership and use more gasoline products. Even though rural exodus is often negatively judged, there are also benefits of migration shared by the local environment and the society as a whole. Well, firstly, global trends of increasing urban migration and population urbanization can provide opportunities for nature conservations, particularly in regions where deforestation is driven by agriculture. As rural dwellers leave their homes, local forests are left to recover. What's more, it is easier for city dwellers to get around. Living in the country means transport can be very difficult. For instance, after midnight, there are no buses or taxis in the countryside. However, there is still a number of public transport modes to choose from in the city. Finally, with more funds and advanced technology, cities endeavor to produce clean energy. New power plants have been built to take harmful methane gas created by the decomposition of rubbish and convert it into electricity. By doing so, an important greenhouse gas is turned into useful energy rather than being directly emitted into the atmosphere. The hustle and bustle of city life offers women the opportunity to explore different professions and pursue their own careers. Women in cities work as engineers, managers, and even football players. This change of roles has affected their marital status and family life. More women are choosing their careers over marriage, which raises the graph of late marriages. As a result, more are remaining single well into their late 30s. They want to be independent and earn money on their own. It is also easier for them to get a promotion while working in the city. Women are slowly achieving wider participation at work, while in rural areas, the mindset is still very conservative. However, cities also change the way that humans interact with each other and the environment, often causing multiple problems. In general, urban wages are significantly higher, so moving to the city is an opportunity to earn what was impossible in rural areas. However, the wage difference is often offset by the higher cost of living and absence of self-produced goods, including subsistence farming. A sizable proportion of new corners attach greater importance to money and gradually abandon their former way of life, thus risking losing their culture. These new city residents are also faced with another problem. According to statistics, crime rates are significantly higher in densely populated urban regions than in rural areas. For instance, property crime rates in our metropolitan areas are 3 to 4 times as high in comparison to the rates in rural communities. Immigrants, upon arrival into cities, typically move into the poor, blighted neighborhoods because that is where they can afford to live. Crime in these areas is high and reflects poor living conditions, as these neighborhoods experience great levels of poverty. This pattern also occurs for violent crimes, which is much more common in large urban areas than elsewhere. In addition, traffic congestion and industrial manufacturing are prominent features of the urban landscape, which take their toll on the natural environment and those who depend on it. Air pollution from both cars and factory emissions affect the health of countless urban residents. Rural to urban migration can boost the urban economy. With a better economy, cities provide their residents with better welfare, but the concentration of services and facilities such as education, health, and technology in urban areas inevitably contributes to greater energy consumption. Another problem with life in the city is traffic congestion. It makes people late to work and thus stresses us out before we even get there. Deliveries can't arrive on time, gas costs money. The quality of life of those commuters starts to decline. What's worse is that if congestion makes it harder to match the right workers to the best jobs, it is economically inefficient as well.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.